Okay, so our next pair of speakers is Kate Hartmann from University of Wyoming. University of Wyoming? Yes, okay, Wyoming, no, University of Wyoming. And me, I'm Connie Kassor at Lawrence University for the next 36 hours. And then Cuyahoga Community College on Monday. So, Kate.
Yes, hello. Yes, from Wyoming, our motto is "The world needs more cowboys." That's real. Yeehaw! Bringing Buddhist philosophy out west. So I just want to thank everyone for organizing this. I also want to thank Jay so much. My first solo teaching experience was here at Amherst when I believe Maria and I was on faculty senate. And both Maria and Jay met with me, and so much of who I am as a teacher now goes back to those first solo teaching experiences. I also want to say thanks to Jay for providing support and resources to people like me who are not philosophers. So if you in the audience find maybe some of the Buddhist metaphysics maybe a little bit confusing, I'll bring it down to the level of people like me who are maybe more on the religious studies side. But I found myself teaching in a philosophy department, even though I'm not trained as a philosopher. And the resources that Jay has made, the books, the articles, the writing that's accessible, and also the feeling of support that even if I'm not trained as a philosopher, I can teach philosophy and my voice is welcome, means the world to me. So in that spirit, my presentation today is inspired by teaching philosophy. So the title is called Shantideva's Dirty Little Tricks, Manipulating Obstacles on the Buddhist Path. So I'm going to start with a scene from my 400 level Buddhist ethics class. The class is based around Jay's Buddhist ethics textbook and then Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, which we go through chapter by chapter. And I like to read aloud, have students read aloud in class. So I'm reading this verse, chapter 2, verse 45. But that is nothing to the feverish horror which grips me, covered in my own uncontrolled excrement, as death's terrifying messengers stand over me. And I kind of let that sit there and get the feeling from students. And a student chimes in and goes, "Feels like emotional manipulation, to be honest." So, the Bodhicharyavatara routinely shocks students. They arrive expecting peaceful Buddhists, meditation, rational philosophy, sounds all the hellfire that they associate with Christianity. Instead, they get Shantideva. And in the first 4 chapters of the Bodhicharyavatara, especially, there's a wild careening between emotional tones. There's rapturous praise, abject terror, grandiose promises, lamentations of foolishness. And this makes for a gripping read, but it can be really alienating to readers who question Shantideva's appeals to these apparently negative emotions like fear, pride, anger, so on and so forth. These are emotions that Shantideva claims he wants to eliminate. He wants us to be fearless. So why does he spend so much time generating fear, anger, pride, so on and so forth? Moreover, readers often find this problematic insofar as it strikes them as manipulative. So when students first told me that Shantideva was manipulative, I kind of wanted to roll my eyes. Sounds like modern therapy speak. Are we going to criticize Shantideva for being toxic? It's not a term that Shantideva would recognize himself, but what I've learned teaching is that students don't necessarily react well to being told their deeply felt objections. They should just ignore them. I've tried. And so I've shifted to a teaching approach that takes these claims seriously, using them as a teaching tool and kind of leaning in, getting students to form the most powerful version of this objection, and using that as kind of a side door into Shantideva's philosophical methods and moral psychology. So my presentation today considers the claim that Shantideva is manipulative, examines 3 cases where Shantideva appears to manipulate readers, and then ultimately argues that characterizing Shantideva as manipulative misunderstands his project insofar as the very objection imports certain claims or assumptions about the nature of persons. And this presentation tracks the moves that I make when I'm teaching, but if you do want the kind of practicalities of how I do this, happy to talk in the Q&A. My argument is that instead of reading Shantideva as manipulative, we should understand his method is grounded in a moral psychology that recognizes the different capacities of practitioners at different stages of the path. For For those at the early stages, still caught in attachment aversion and primal confusion, purely rational argumentation is insufficient. They require other modes of persuasion. And this interpretation is really inspired by J. Garfield's insight that Buddhist ethics is more concerned with how to become good rather than what it is to be good. That is, Shantideva wants to persuade people who are not yet good or perfectly rational how to enter a path that will make them good and more rational. And I also want to say at the outset, because I could feel people's hands wanting to raise, that I won't be invoking the doctrine of upaya or skillful means, whereby Buddhas and Bodhisattvas skillfully do whatever it takes to help beings. I'm not using that concept for two reasons. One, Shantideva is not a Buddha or Bodhisattva, doesn't claim to be, which I do take to be a relevant difference. There is debate in the literature about who can use upaya. But my major reason I'm not doing it is that when you tell students about upaya, their takeaway sometimes is, okay, so Buddhas are just manipulative. Got it. So it doesn't actually address the student's objection to just say, oh yeah, well in Buddhism it's okay to manipulate people. I don't want them to think that. So instead I wanted a method that takes their objection seriously on their own terms, leans in, provides the strongest version of that argument, and then tries to uncover maybe some of the assumptions that get ported in. So let's start by clarifying what I mean by manipulation. I'm relying on Robert Nagel here. As an everyday concept, manipulation is a form of influence that's not direct coercion, but neither is it rational persuasion. And the very word has a negative connotation, so it's a bad thing to manipulate people. There are various accounts of why manipulation is wrong. It's not actually easy to answer this question. Does it violate autonomy by bypassing the rational faculties? Does it harm the people by leading them to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do? Or does it deceive people? We don't need to decide between those accounts. Students are often drawing kind of pluralistically on various accounts of manipulation, but we do want to be attuned to their use in Shantideva. So, dirty trick number one, fear. Shantideva's first dirty trick is scaring the bejesus out of his audience. So, Shantideva writes, chapter 2, the verse that I said before, that's nothing but the fever Torah which grips me, standing in my own uncontrolled excrements, as death's terrifying messengers stand over me. With cowering glances, I search the four directions for deliverance. What saint will deliver me from this great fear? Seeing the directions devoid of deliverance, I fall into total confusion once again. So on one level, Shantideva's purpose here is clear. He wants to contrast this terror with the safety offered by taking refuge. Immediately after these passages, he leads people to go for refuge. But rather than presenting these options straightforwardly, Shantideva intensifies fear through vivid imagery, making ordinary existence seem unbearable, and refuge seem more attractive by comparison. This approach resembles manipulation, and I break students into groups and have them. I give them a certain amount of verses and tell them to make the case for why it's manipulative, and to come up with several real-world examples that parallel this. And usually they're thinking about human relationships, boyfriends, girlfriends, and the lies they tell each other. This is what they're thinking about. Might as well go there. And the students tell me that this activates readers' worst fears, triggering a fight or flight reaction that bypasses rational thinking, leading frightened people to make choices they wouldn't otherwise make. Dirty trick number 2 is extracting promises that people can't keep. So in chapter 3, verses 23 and 24, Shantideva leads readers to cultivate awakening mind, making them promise, or sort of leading them through this exercise of promising to liberate all beings from cyclic existence. And he says that he makes this promise with, quote, serene confidence. But all of a sudden, Shantideva slowly reveals the commitment that has been made here. He tells readers, well, now that you've made this promise, you're part of the Buddhist family. You don't want to bring shame to your family, do you? That'd be embarrassing. And so in the text, Shantideva starts to reconsider this promise. He says, maybe this was a foolish promise that I've made. Should I reconsider? He says, it is proper to reconsider whether or not one should carry out any rash undertaking or anything not thoroughly thought through, even if one has already promised to do it. That's chapter 4, verse 2. He even reflects that he was in a, quote, state of intoxication and speaking without realizing my limitations. In other words, Shantideva recognizes that he has made this promise out of fear. He's led his readers to make this promise out of fear. or out of gratitude for being free of the fear that he had earlier cultivated. But he doesn't know if he has the ability to actually uphold this promise that he has made. And I realize that Shantideva isn't holding himself to the standards of US contract law, but many of our philosophy students are pre-law, and again, we want more philosophy majors, so happy to help them understand the US legal system. But it's worth pointing out that a contract made in the US is not legally valid if it's made under coercion, intimidation, if adequate consideration has not been provided, or if one party is not capable of meeting the obligations. And so interestingly, all of the things talked about in US contract law, Shantideva acknowledges that he has led people to make a promise that they can't keep and that they didn't consider. So Shantideva is aware that he violates these conditions, but does that thereby free the reader from the promise? No. So he makes it even worse. He tells readers, moreover, after making a promise of this kind, if I were not to fulfill it in practice and broke my word to all these beings, what would be my future birth? Chapter 4, verse 4. So in twisted fashion, Shantideva first scares readers by talking about the torments of hell and convinces them to make this promise that then further exposes them to the torments of hell. Okay, dirty trick number 3, pride, anger, and hatred. So his third dirty trick is deliberately stirring up readers' pride and anger, more emotions that he ostensibly wants to eliminate. But Shantideva approvingly cites these emotions when he's describing a proud warrior as a model for aspiring bodhisattvas. Quote, for this reason, I shall not cast off the burden here until the enemies are struck down before my eyes. Once their anger has been aroused, people who are inflated with pride do not sleep until their enemy has been slain, even if he caused only a slight offense. Chapter 3, verse 36 and 37. We might expect Shantideva to condemn the anger displayed here. He even includes this detail that it's anger aroused by a small offense. And he will later do that in chapter 6. We get the anger chapter. But instead, here in chapter 3, he tells readers to adopt this mindset against the defilements. He summons the reader's warrior bravado, declaring, I do not care if my guts ooze out, let my head fall off. But never shall I bow down before the enemy, the defilements. Chapter 4, verse 44. He personifies the attachments and aversions as personified enemies, deliberately triggering the desire for revenge and the narrow vision and recklessness that often come with anger and a desire for revenge. Again, the very things he's later going to argue against. But so, having led students to generate these cases against Shantideva, now I lead them to ask, is this wrong? What specifically is wrong about these cases? So, first, does Shantideva harm the reader? We might worry that Shantideva pressures readers into a self-sacrificial path that helps others but harms them. However, as J. Garfield wisely notes, Buddhist traditions consistently argue that ethical training is, quote, of primary benefit to the moral agent. The apparent disjunction between self-interest and other interest is actually illusory in the Buddhist tradition. The promise to help all beings is good for the person who makes it. Second, is Shantideva deceiving readers into doing something that they don't want to do? This might be true if Shantideva was addressing non-Buddhists, but he isn't. He's addressing himself, famously, but also those with minds who work like his, fellow Buddhists who are at least on some level wanting to undertake this path, but find themselves trapped by psychological obstacles. He's not tricking them. He's helping them to do something that they already want to do, but find themselves unable to do. Third, does Shantideva's manipulation violate readers' autonomy? Again, this assumes that autonomous agency is Shantideva's starting point, which now that students have made these cases of manipulation, I ask them, is it true that Shantideva takes this to be the starting point? What gives you this idea? From Shantideva's view, students slowly come to realize people begin in primal confusion rather than genuine agency. Such agency can only be achieved by removing pathologies in Buddhist training. Shantideva doesn't assume that readers have that agency to start with, nor that they will respond to rational argumentation. They're still so caught up in attachment, aversion, and confusion. So as I work through these questions with students, we can both understand some of the assumptions that drive the objection of manipulation, and we get a better understanding of Shantideva himself and of the challenges that he's facing. He wants to persuade readers to do something that is difficult yet beneficial. If they were rational, they would choose it, but they aren't. And they want to do it. Or maybe they want to do it, but they can't, not on their own at least. So Shantideva must work with the psychological resources available to early stage practitioners. Often these are the lower emotions like fear, pride, shame, and anger, which dominate. Later, after much training, practitioners might be motivated by things like compassion, but Shantideva isn't addressing already good persons. He has to work with people's existing emotions, meeting them where they are, rather than expecting transformation through reasoning alone. So in each case, Shantideva skillfully deploys existing negative emotions to overcome specific obstacles. So at the outset, when people are just attached to sense pleasures and deluded about karmic consequences, he terrifies them, prompting them to seek refuge. When the comfort of refuge might lead to complacency, he reminds readers of their binding promise, deploying shame and the fear of consequences to prevent backsliding. When doubt arises as to their ability to fulfill promises, he whips up anger and pride, making practitioners unwilling to submit to the defilements. And so the effect here is like a ratchet, which makes forward motion relatively easy while preventing backwards motion. Similarly, leveraging these strong emotions, Shantideva makes the present situation intolerable, so you can't see where you are. He arouses the specific emotion that will overcome the next obstacle, making forward motion relatively easy, and makes it then hard to backslide. In this way, he aims to give readers a practical way to become good and appeals to the resources that they already have in order to do so. So by understanding Shantideva's approach, we can address objections that the Bodhicharya Avatara is improperly manipulative. While his methods seem extreme when evaluated within his worldview, we see that Shantideva doesn't harm, violate, or trick readers, but uses the tools available for beings at the early stages of the path. Students still do find this unpalatable, but that's okay. I'd rather they understand the tradition on its own terms and disagree with it, rather than have them blandly disagree with some made-up fantasy, feel-good Buddhism. And it is at least one step better than if they say, well, it seems manipulative to me, and I'm like, that's not a term that is useful here, like, let's talk about this other thing. This at least gets them into the text, dealing with the specific verses, making the best case for why Shantideva is improperly manipulative. And then we kind of do the reveal of what Shantideva's methods are that now they better understand. So in this, Shantideva exemplifies J. Garfield's insight that Buddhist ethics focuses more on becoming good than on what it is to be good. Shantideva provides a pathway to genuine agency and rationality by working with practitioners' existing psychological resources and then trusting that once they're on the path itself will transform them. Shantideva may employ dirty tricks, but after all, lotuses do emerge from the muck. So, thank you.
I'll speak loudly. Okay, hi everybody. I want to start, before I start talking about my paper, I want to start with a little bit of a caveat. I'm going to talk about philosophy today, but the bulk of the argument that I'm talking about is in an essay that's forthcoming, so I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds. Because we're all here to honor Jay, I just want to give a warning that I am going to take some of my time in an attempt to embarrass Jay a little bit. I'm going to try not to cry, but we'll see what happens. But I want to start with an article that Jay Garfield and Graham Priest wrote in 2003, or was published in 2003, Nagarjuna and the Limits of Thought. And in this article, Garfield and Priest show how Nagarjuna discovers and explores true contradictions at the limits of thought in his Mulammadhyamaka Kataka. And they argue that Nagarjuna's philosophy aligns with the views of some Western philosophers, but also adds something important to the conversation about paraconsistent logic. Now, I'm not going to rehash the arguments that they present in their article here, but just to summarize, they examine Nagarjuna's arguments about the two truths, about emptiness, and about all of the seemingly paradoxical things that we find in the Mulammadhyamaka Kataka. And they conclude that Nagarjuna is not, as some might read him, an irrationalist or a mystic, right? He is rather somebody who uses logic and reasoning to analyze everything, including logic and reasoning itself. And the result, they argue, is that Nagarjuna finds true contradictions at the limits of thought. These are called enclosure contradictions, and they might be best conveyed by the expression, to quote Garfield and Priest, quoting Nagarjuna, quoting the Prajnaparamita Sutra, all things have one nature, that is, no nature. Now, I'm assuming that mostly everybody here is familiar with the basic Madhyamaka presentation of the two truths and the paradoxical idea, or the seemingly paradoxical idea that everything is empty, including emptiness itself. So I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I want to use this particular article as a starting point for a couple of reasons. So first, as I mentioned, this article was published in 2003. In 2003, I was a student at Smith, and I was studying with Jay, just beginning to learn about Buddhist philosophy. So I think of this article as a sort of snapshot of the particular views on Nagarjuna and Madhyamaka that Jay was wrestling with and thinking about when he first introduced me to Buddhist philosophy. And secondly, as every good Buddhist philosopher knows, all compounded phenomena are impermanent, right? Everything in our conventional reality changes. And while Buddhist philosophers might try to argue that the great thinkers in their traditions never change their views, that they always have the correct interpretation of the Buddhist teachings, a close reader of any single philosopher's writings can deduce a sort of evolution of thought over the course of their career. So I think that if we look at Jay's writing over the last couple of decades, we can identify a particular sort of evolution in terms of the things that he's writing about and the things that he's wrestling with. So I'll get to that later, just something to keep in mind. But I also want to use this article because I do want to spend a little bit of my time here thinking about the limits of thought in Buddhist philosophy. So when we're talking about the limits of thought in Madhyamaka, we're talking about this problem that arises when we try to explain the ultimate truth of emptiness. The ultimate truth is, by definition, inconceivable and inexpressible, and yet Madhyamaka philosophers go to great lengths to conceptualize and explain the ultimate truth and show what it is and what it isn't. So we run into apparent contradictions when we start talking about the things that we can't talk about and trying to conceive the things that are, by definition, inconceivable. So in their article, Garfield and Priest write about these contradictions that we find at the limits of thought, at this final limit of ultimate reality. And there's a lot of interesting and compelling stuff there, but what I think that this article overlooks is the process involved in actually arriving at that limit. I think if we look at the Mula Madhyamaka Karika as a whole, we can read Nagarjuna as describing, at least in part, a process that one should follow in order to eventually realize the ultimate truth. So before arriving at the limits of thought, a Madhyamika must approach the limits of thought. I think this is why Nagarjuna writes in the very last verse of the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, I prostrate to Gautama, who through compassion taught the true doctrine which leads to the relinquishing of all views. Right? The Buddha taught the Dharma in order to relinquish all views. I think this is important. This signals a kind of process. The Buddha teaches the Dharma, and then based on that teaching, one relinquishes all views. A Madhyamika doesn't just jump straight to the limits of thought. She approaches that through study and practice over a long period of time. Or as the Tibetan philosophers put it, through the accumulation of merit and wisdom, through the deepening of one's knowledge and the broadening of one's compassion. So I want to talk about approaching the limits of thought in Madhyamaka. But in order to do that, I want to take a brief detour. One of the most impactful things that I learned from Jay is the importance of approaching a problem from a broad perspective. Right? Jay taught me that philosophy is not limited to the Greeks or the Germans, and that when we're considering tricky problems, we can often benefit from taking a step back
and considering solutions that might be offered in other contexts. So in wrestling with the tricky problem of the limits of thought in Madhyamaka, I found it helpful to think about limits from the perspective of particle physics. I've written about this elsewhere, but basically I think that if we consider particle physics and the theory of special relativity, we can understand something about limits, and this might help us in understanding what Nagarjuna and other Madhyamikas have to say about the limits of thought. So I'm not going to give you a physics lecture, but just very briefly, according to the theory of relativity, as a particle speeds up, time slows and distances shrink. So physicists call this dilation. They use a mathematical equation to explain this. And basically, the way the equation works out, if you plot this on a graph, you end up with this asymptotic curve, right? So as a particle speeds up, approaching the speed of light, time and space shrink to almost nothing. So in other words, we could view this as a limit that's approached. Now, theoretically, from the perspective of a particle that's traveling at the speed of light, the universe would be timeless and dimensionless. But this is impossible to represent mathematically, because in the equation, if the speed of the particle that we're considering is equivalent to the speed of light, you end up dividing by 0, right, which is mathematically impossible. So we have a situation, much like the one that Garfield and Priest identify in the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, where we're dealing with a paradoxical limit. Right? When we're talking about particle physics, we can use mathematical reasoning to approximate the limit of the speed of light, but at the limit itself, mathematical reasoning no longer works to explain things. Similarly, when we're talking about Madhyamaka philosophy, we can use concepts and language to approximate that limit of the ultimate truth, but at the limit itself, concepts and language no longer work to explain things. Here's why I think this analogy is useful. In physics, we can mathematically approximate what happens when a particle approaches that limit of the speed of light, even when we understand that math doesn't hold up at that limit. And in Madhyamaka, again, we can linguistically and conceptually approximate what happens when a mind approaches the limit of the realization of the ultimate truth, even when we know that language and concepts can't hold up at that limit. But in both cases, we can understand the approach to that limit as asymptotic in nature. There's always a little bit further to progress. There's always a way to get a little bit closer to that final idealized limit. So in Nagarjuna's presentation of Madhyamaka, the more deeply one understands the Dharma taught by the Buddha, the closer one approaches to the limits of thought. Now, there is, of course, the question of how one actually arrives at that limit, and this is something, again, I've written about elsewhere, and this could be the focus of a whole other presentation. And this is an interesting and worthy topic to consider, but that's a soteriological issue. For now, I want us to stay firmly grounded in conventional reality in the realm of concepts and language and philosophical reasoning. Because, as Garfield and Priest put it in their 2003 article, quote, ultimate reality is just as empty as conventional reality. Ultimate reality is hence only conventionally real. The distinct realities are therefore identical. So in other words, the ultimate truth is empty, so the conventional is really what we have to work with. The arrival at the limits of thought, the direct realization of the ultimate truth, is the domain of fully awakened Buddhas. And as far as I'm aware, nobody in this room today is a fully awakened Buddha, so I'm going to stick to the conventional realm. So conventional reality, I think, is where the important and the meaningful work happens. So what an asymptotic approach to the limits of thought suggests is that no matter how much we, ordinary beings, study and practice, no matter how much philosophy we do, no matter how much knowledge and compassion we cultivate, we can always do more. We can always get a little bit better. There's always room in conventional reality to work to deepen one's understanding of the Dharma a little bit more, to work to become a little bit more ethical, and to cultivate compassion just a little bit more deeply. To give another analogy, consider a musician.
No matter how expert, say, a bassoonist might be with her instrument, she's never going to get to a point where she decides she's reached the limits of her ability and she doesn't need to practice anymore. Right? The more skilled she gets at her instrument, the more subtle her process becomes, but she never reaches a final limit of what she can do with her instrument. So too with Buddhist philosophers. No matter how deep a person's understanding of the Dharma might be, the philosopher, at least through analysis alone, will never get to a point where they reach the limits of conceptual thought and no longer need to study or understand anything further. The more deeply one understands the Dharma, the more subtle one's understanding becomes. And as long as we're working with concepts in conventional reality, there's always going to be more to know. And following Mahayana doctrines, the more deeply we know the Dharma, this also follows that we more deeply and extensively can cultivate compassion. Okay, so now I want to bring this all back to Jay. If we look at what he's written and taught and talked about since that 2003 article, which was 22 years ago, which feels very weird, I think we can see his work leaning into that asymptotic curve. All of us who know Jay know that he's never been one content to rest on his laurels. And more recently, in Jay's writing career, we can see that he's continued to deepen and expand his own understandings of Madhyamaka and Pramana and ethics and other aspects of Buddhist philosophy. But he's also begun to write more explicitly on ways that philosophy is connected to the real world, and more importantly to issues of things like racism and social justice and white supremacy. 25 years ago, in 2000, we saw the publication of Empty Words. This was a collection of Jay's previously published essays on cross-cultural philosophy. So he was making the case that we should consider things outside of the Western philosophical tradition. More recently, in 2016, Garfield and Brian Van Norden wrote an essay for the New York Times. It was called "If Philosophy Won't Diversify, Let's Call It What It Really Is." I'll give you a spoiler if you haven't read the article. Garfield and Van Norden think that this undiversified philosophy should just be called Departments of Euro-American Philosophy. This article made a lot of white philosophers angry. But even more recently, in 2020, in a public-facing piece on the need for the globalization of philosophy for an online journal called Oxford Studies in Public Philosophy, Jay wrote this, and I quote, "Philosophy has been slower than other humanities disciplines to recognize that there's a world beyond Europe, broadly construed, and intellectual traditions that do not arise in classical Greece. Scholars of history, literature, music, and art no longer tolerate entirely Eurocentric approaches to research or to curriculum, but the vast majority of departments in the world, of philosophy departments in the world, are quite content to do so. Philosophy so conceived is nothing but a sub-department of the broader field of white studies. I find that embarrassing." So I think what we see from these examples is a deepening of Jay's understanding of philosophy as a discipline and of his understanding of the needs for academics like himself to speak out against things like injustice and racism. This is evidence, I think, of the further deepening of Jay's wisdom and compassion along this asymptotic curve. But it's not just the content of Jay's writings that demonstrate this. It's the means by which he has produced scholarship that's also deepened along this asymptotic curve. We all know that Jay works hard to include others in his projects. And in more recent years, we've seen an increase in his public-facing scholarship, his co-authored publications, and his efforts to include colleagues and students, and I would argue even diehard Western philosophical chauvinists into his scholarship. These are all evidence of Jay's commitment to continuing to understand Buddhist philosophy more deeply and to be more compassionate while doing so. So if we view the Madhyamaka approach to the limits of thought as asymptotic, we can see that there's always more to learn, there's always more to teach, and there are always ways to become more skillful, more just, and more compassionate in our conventional world. Jay's work shows us how that's possible, and it serves Ooh, I'm gonna get choked up. Serves as a model for us, for all of us, teaching us not only how to continue to become better scholars, but also better human beings. So, thank you. All right, we have time for questions. Yeah?
Hi, just beautiful works from both of you. Thank you so much. I have a question for our first speaker and potentially a follow-up on it. I would love to hear your thoughts on is initially indulging student claims without their proper educational background or rational background endorsing and promoting that same egocentricity of my point or my view is salient merely because it's mine? And do you think that's a problem?
Is the my in the question you, the student?
Yes. So initially endorsing the claim that Shantideva is manipulative, essentially endorsing that same egocentric my point or my feeling that Shantideva is manipulative is salient and important and should be considered merely because it's mine.
Yeah, it's interesting insofar as there's two ways we can think about teaching. Do students just need to shut up and be assimilated into this thing that they don't? Or do I want to do kind of what Shantideva does, or what I take Shantideva to do, and to meet people where they are and then try to bring them maybe further into the text with me? So sometimes I find it challenging teaching students, constantly seeing in them in unconditional positive regard. My partner's a therapist. Therapists see their clients in unconditional positive regard. That's really hard to maintain sometimes. But I psych myself in my office and to have this philosophy of yes and instead of saying, it's really problematic that you have that question. So do I want students to stay there necessarily? I think if the end result was, yes, your initial kind of knee-jerk reaction to this text is totally right and doesn't need to be problematized, and you're such a hero for thinking that, I don't think that works, but also the flip side of saying, the very fact that you asked that question shows that you're a bad person is not a teaching philosophy that should endorse. Maybe a follow-up.
Yeah, just that. So then does that encouragement or that acknowledgement of that feeling work as a means to an end of ultimately proving them wrong? So by acknowledging it or by saying, giving that thought any merit, are you merely treating that thought as a means towards the end, which will be ultimately proving them wrong?
I really make clear, especially in the state of Wyoming, I am not pushing any religious views on any students. Don't tell any legislators that. Because students do. There are churches in Laramie, Wyoming, that tell their students to be careful about taking classes in religion or philosophy or the humanities generally because they're afraid that we're going to make them feel stupid or disprove them. I always tell students, here's an argumentative path and journey. At the end, you don't have to accept it. So it's not at the end of the class. I've just taken the longer way around to saying that the student is stupid and shouldn't have raised the question. But I do hope that I say, trust me for a little bit. Let's go on this journey together. And then at the end of the journey, you can get off the train. This is a very mixed metaphor. They have to decide capital T truth questions for themselves. And I find that students like that. As I said at the outset of Shantideva, I think students really don't like Shantideva. But in walking together with Shantideva, hopefully their rejection at the end is different than their rejection at the beginning, that we've all gained something in that process. I hope so.
Okay. My question is also for you. Thanks so much for your talk. I had a lot of fun. I'm so curious, were there certain passages in Shantideva where typically class after class students are like, you know what, just screw this, versus,
Yes.
and what are those? And then the flip side, passages where they're like, oh, you know what, actually this is attractive, I could get on board.
Yeah, the fact that I open with this quote, that's nothing to the feverish horror which grips me covered in my own uncontrolled excrement as death's terrifying messengers stand over me, that's the one they really have a problem with. Because the students that find their way to my class, you know, I have very committed religious people, but then also a lot of people who have maybe complicated relationships with the religions that they were raised in, and they're coming to Buddhism as the fantasy of the thing that isn't what their parents' religion is. And so I could teach a version of Buddhist modernism that would be, you know, perfectly friendly to them, that would be a feel-good form of Buddhism. But I like leaning into the stuff that makes them feel anything, even if it doesn't make them feel happy, because once you have some feelings, then we can work on them. But yeah, they don't like this, and they don't like Shantideva's misogyny. So, long passages of misogyny. And you say, well, there's these passages where Shantideva tells readers to imagine women as like skin bags and all of their gross toenails and whatnot. I said, oh, yeah, this is for a male monastic audience that might be struggling with celibacy. But they don't. So there's various things they don't like about Shantideva.
I have a question, and I think it goes off Lorelai's question really well. Because I was wondering at the beginning of your talk, you said, you know, I think that I've argued that Shantideva is not problematically manipulative. And I think there's a question about is it just manipulative full stop or problematically manipulative? But I think my question is because throughout your talk, I got the sense that you were actually partially in agreement with your students that it is manipulative. And so I was wondering if you could see it or do see it partially as an aesthetic question about what manipulation means when we talk about emotions, and whether you think that it would be valuable or talk with your students about what do we consider to be an emotion in the context of reading this text? Because if we're talking about fear, you're not running out of the room when you read this. So perhaps there's a level of manipulation, if we want to call it that, that's actually rhetoric, and that Shantideva is very well aware, as he's writing, that he's provoking these aesthetic emotions, but that they're not attached to an individual, if that makes sense.
Yeah, in some sense you need to be on board. I mean, the worst case scenario is that students just don't feel anything because they've just looked at all the words in order and thought that that was reading. So they don't. It's close. You have to be sort of on board for what Shantideva is doing, open to the aesthetic experience, because very much I think he is a literary master. He's writing in poetry, in verse. It's deliberately provoking these emotions. And I like talking with students about manipulation and what forms of it are okay. Often in the classes where I talk about this, we have a segue to are grades manipulative? And what am I doing to you students when I'm giving you grades? Are you meant to feel afraid? Are you meant to do this? And to some extent, I'm working through some of my questions about manipulation, right? This is a whole paper about how I try to manipulate students into learning. And I don't think that there is an obvious answer here at the end. A very smart student can at the end decide, no, I'm not on board for that. And that's great. And others can decide they're willing, but recognizing that Shantideva is making trade-offs and he is doing things that maybe we're going to be a little bit uncomfortable with. That's what's fun about philosophy.
Yeah, this is also a follow-up from that. I was wondering, I guess given that I'm sympathetic with the idea that kind of need that manipulation at first because early on the Buddhist path, one is so wrapped up in all these various emotions. My question is whether you can avoid manipulation if you want to affect change at all.
Yeah.
And whether if later on the path there is a time when rationality actually becomes effective. I'm not sure, actually. right? Sometimes this is referred to as emotions or recalcitrance to reason. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, so that's good, actually, foreshadowing. I was wondering what you thought about that. Is there this time where maybe equanimity can help one become a little bit more open-minded, a little bit more receptive to reason, or is emotion just, resistant to any change?
Really great question, and much could be said about that. I like to think that the emotions are at least shapeable or trainable. I've just started on my first book comes out on May 9th. And I've just started on the second book project on Buddhism, addiction, and recovery, because I take the state of a person who's struggling with substance abuse, and full disclosure, my mom's been in recovery my whole life, of the paradigmatic case of someone who wants to do something but finds themselves unable to do it. And so looking at Buddhist recovery programs and how they kind of intersect, often somewhat uncomfortably, with 12-step as a case of, one, I want to talk to actual people in recovery and how they navigated the spiritual but not religious, but often maybe uncomfortable 12-step stuff, but then maybe some Buddhist stuff, but also take the philosophical problem seriously. That if Buddhism, some people, especially in America, approach Buddhism as, I'm an upper middle class educated person and I'd like to be slightly more productive at work, maybe I'll meditate. But if you approach Buddhism from this position of moral injury or moral weakness or a weakness of the will, it's a whole different set of problems. And so I'm interested in all of that.
Yeah, it's really hard to say, I think, at those points, right? Yeah, and those Buddhist recovery programs, they don't as much rely on reason and rationality, right? And you can question whether they're manipulative, but it's you're going into that kind of manipulative space and you're intentionally doing it to change yourself.
Yeah, and I've written some on this, there's 22 different Buddhist recovery program manuals out there, some of which are more kind of hyper-rational version of Buddhism, some of which aren't. But in some ways I see myself as really inspired by what Connie said of how do we make this Buddhist philosophy stuff intersect with the real world? Mm-hmm. And so I had to do an IRB. I get to talk to actual people about their problems. And again, seeing how Buddhist philosophy, as much fun as it is to read books and do stuff, also talk to people who are navigating real challenges.
I'm going to take prerogative here as the person at the head of the table with you. I mean, I don't know. I'm just thinking in this conversation. I mean, is Shantideva really being manipulative, or is he just being really persuasive?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that
is he just a good philosopher who's who's good at making arguments?
Those things sort of exist on a spectrum, right? Yeah. And even in the word manipulation, right, it has those negative connotations, right? Such that we kind of, the minute an argument is improper, that's what's manipulation. But often when I'm going in front of university committees to try to argue for the humanities and stuff, I'm trying to manipulate people. I am uncomfortable with that. And I think, it's an interesting grading, right? Manipulative. You try to be ethical, but you also, I'm trying to overcome my inclination to make students feel safe and comfortable all the time, which I understand where that's coming from. There's a time and place for that, but sometimes if you make it too easy, too comfortable, you gotta let them sometimes experience strong emotions.
I think reason is manipulative. So the manipulation might be trivial in the end, if reason is manipulative. I think it is. So an argument that's not, I don't see it.
But I do also want to preserve the space to say that certain kinds of things are wrong.
Manipulation is
too persuasive.
I'm not saying that thing, but manipulation. And the issue is everything seems manipulative. So.
My students have compared Shantideva to a used car salesman. It's great. He's like, you gotta follow the bodhisattva.
What's it going to take to get you on the Bodhisattva path?
Both vehicles.
These are great vehicles.
So you talked about one of the ways that he manipulates is to get people to make promises they can't keep. Might part of that teaching be that we don't have selves that can control and keep promises? Like, what promise could you keep?
Well, I promised I'd come to this symposium and to write a paper, and I was real nervous about it, but
Is promise a good framework to begin with? Doesn't promise import a whole bunch of things he wants us to be skeptical about?
yeah. And so we read the chapter on vow in the Buddhist Ethics, the book that Jay wrote, and talk, if vow, I like the language of promise because vow sounds, big and scary to students. But promise, for whatever reason, makes more intuitive sense. And
But should it? Based on his worldview. If you're trying to get to nirvana, do you want to be making promises?
I mean, to some extent, yeah, I'm comfortable with the notion of that Shantideva is trying to get people to commit themselves to a path that they don't fully understand and are not yet competent to do.
And so maybe shouldn't be making promises about.
Yeah, but, I know a lot of friends who've gotten married and they're not sure they can keep that promise. And yet, committing themselves to a future that's unknown is itself morally transformative, right? Promises that we don't know if we can keep are significant.
In a self-dependent world.
Well, I think the non-self-self conversation can be somewhat clouded insofar as sometimes we take the non-self thing a bit too far. We all do have a sense of personhood. And so I don't think that we need to eliminate any sense of being a person who has certain sorts of promises and continuity and responsibilities and things of that nature. But maybe I'm not understanding.
Well, it's worth thinking about.
Yes.
Yeah, I would open-endedly respond to that by saying sometimes it's not about what the word that's actually written, but how it's like sounded like audibly. I'm a Hindustani classical musician, and so like I deal with like the Sanskrit, and it's not just supposed to be memorized, but once you memorize it, you get to a point where it becomes melodic. It sends you into a euphoric state, essentially. And there are entire South Asian and East Asian traditions of Buddhism where chanting Namo Amida Butsu like sends someone into a euphoric state. So it's not just, and that's based off of the Prime Vow, the whole tradition of Pure Land Buddhism, Jodo Shinshu in Japan.
Right.
But what I mean to say is sometimes we have to look beyond the text because we're supposed to teach beyond the text and learn what people 2,000 years ago who were studying like not just like Buddhist philosophy, but they were studying like the Vedic philosophy as well, the Rig Vedas, the Yajur Vedas, the Sama Veda, if you want to talk about sound. And so I'm really, I can't say much because I drove 3 hours up from New York City, so I just got here. But I'm really enthusiastic about the symposium and what we have to talk about Shantideva. And I particularly like the last speaker, the example of musicians and also physics, because a lot of like sound theory can answer a bunch of the questions of where people were trying to, and like the Bodhisattva path, like treating that as like a vector or a vehicle as a vector. And mandalas. Yeah. Yeah, mandalas question mark, because you're talking about diagrams, and I'm just like, where are the mandalas? You know?
So maybe last.
Oh, just very quickly, it is worth thinking about the self. And for anybody who has not yet read this book by Garfield that came out a few years ago, I've listened to it twice. It's available on Audible. And maybe even ask him to sign it for you. And it is a wonderful way to contemplate the limits of self and what self means versus person, which is what you mentioned. And I can't recommend this book enough. And that's not just because I am very fond of Jay. Come on, buy your own.
So it's noon. We are going to take 1 hour for lunch. Andy, do you want to say anything?
First, let's thank our speakers.